Hello everyone, Cosmological here. Now, you might think that there's some sort of elephant in the room that I should address, but you're wrong. There isn't one, and I won't address it. Anyway, Alex O'Connor, also known as Cosmic Skeptic, recently released a podcast episode where he had a discussion with William Lane Craig, a professional theologian and Christian apologist, on the Kalam Cosmological Argument. If you haven't watched it yet, I highly recommend that you do, either before or after watching this video. While Craig wasn't the originator of the Kalam argument, he's been the main contemporary proponent of it, and he's also the one who gave it that name. If you're not familiar, the argument is very simple. It has a few variations, but it usually goes like this. Premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, the universe had a cause. Now, this argument actually has a lot going for it. It's very simple, and it's a logically valid argument, which means that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. And there is a lot of discussion to be had about this argument. I found Alex and Dr. Craig's discussion to be very interesting and thought-provoking, so I wanted to share some of my thoughts on it, and particularly address some areas where I disagreed with either Dr. Craig or with Alex.
So the only way to attack this argument, the only way to raise objections is raising objections with the premises. Now,
Right.
I find that most people, when they try to raise objections, they jump to the second premise.
The main objection to that premise would be that it's not really known whether the universe began to exist per se. I mean, we can point to the first instant of the Big Bang as the beginning of the universe as we know it, but that's really just as far back as we can go until our understanding of physics breaks down. Maybe new discoveries in science will eventually be able to determine whether the universe really began to exist, but I don't think it's the realm of the philosopher to try and claim with certainty that it did. I would also mention that the first premise is also quite often objected to by atheists who have given the argument some thought. Alex himself has expressed an objection to it, but for a very good analysis of some issues with the Kalam's first premise, I highly recommend the videos by Scott Clifton of Theoretical Bullshit on the argument, which I'll link to in the description and cards.
You can imagine some kind of light bulb that is programmed to switch on and off at particular intervals. And it's programmed such that you have a length of time, let's say, 10 minutes, that once half the remaining time has elapsed, the switch gets hit, right? So it starts off, and halfway between the kind of time elapsing, the light bulb gets turned on, and then halfway between the remaining time, it gets turned off, and halfway between the remaining time, then it gets turned off. And obviously the on and off switch is increasing in speed in terms of how quickly it's going on and off. Now, the reason that this is an interesting point to raise is that by the time the actual time has elapsed, it seems that you actually have a substantiation, a thing that has actually happened an infinite number of times. And we have to answer the question of whether the light bulb would be on and off at the end of the question. But the kind of real question, the real interesting part is relevant to this discussion, is that if you had such a programmed light bulb, it would seem not just that you've kind of got a potentially divisible, potentially infinitely divisible space, but that an actual infinite number of things has happened in a finite amount of time.
This is an interesting point, reminiscent of Zeno's paradoxes. However, I don't think this is a good reason to posit that an actually infinite number of things could exist in real life, because such a device could never be built. It would have to turn on and off an infinite number of times within the space of microseconds, and there's a limit to how fast electronics can work. If you wanted to use a thought experiment to prove that an actual infinity could exist in reality, it would have to be grounded in something realistic.
We should press the reason this is important to the argument, to the Kalam, is that essentially we're trying to address the idea that the universe could have been eternal, because this is one of the atheist escape routes many of the time. Is to just say, well, look, yes, maybe there needs to be some kind of explanation for the causes that caused everything, but what if that just goes back eternally and the universe is eternal? And what you're trying to demonstrate here is that the universe can't be eternal because it leads to logical absurdities.
Oh, not logical, Alex. I would say metaphysical. There's no logical contradiction in the notion of the actual infinite. Infinite set theory is a well-understood branch of mathematics. It's perfectly consistent and coherent. But I maintain that when you try to instantiate it in the world of the real,
Right.
that then it leads to these absurdities. And the Thomson lamp illustration is an example of that second argument that I mentioned for the finitude of the past, the impossibility of forming an actually infinite collection by successive addition, like switchings on and off of a lamp.
The absurdity from the lamp thought experiment came from the idea of trying to fit an actual infinite number of events into a finite amount of time. But when you take the whole universe, which is made up of everything in existence, I don't really see it as absurd to propose that it could have existed for an infinite amount of time. In that case, you would be trying to fit everything, whether the universe is itself finite or infinite, into an infinite amount of time, which I see as much more plausible than the reverse.
Okay, so the second objection that this raises and why it's important is that you can ask the question, if an actually infinite number of things or number of events or something like that is impossible to be real, in the sense that we're using the term real, does God not count as an actual infinite?
Now, it's important to understand here, Alex, that this is not an objection to either premise. It would just show that the theist is going to have a problem too, but it doesn't do anything to refute the argument. Now, theists have typically, well, not typically, universally held that God is not composed of parts.
Yeah.
God is not an aggregate of definite and discrete elements that make up a collection, and therefore the notion of God's infinity is not a mathematical notion. It's not a quantitative notion. It's a qualitative notion. It means things like God is perfectly holy, omniscient, omnipotent, timeless, spaceless, and so forth. All of those sort of qualitative attributes go to make up God's infinity, but the infinity of God is not a quantitative concept.
It seems like a bit of a cop-out to me to say that the concept of God's infinity is just qualitative. Infinity is an inherently quantitative notion. And even if God is simple, i.e. not composed of parts, I see no reason why that excuses the infinitude of it.
So, anticipating this reply, I was thinking about the concept of the afterlife, and how
Yes.
the reason why it's not problematic to say that the afterlife is infinite is because that seems to be a potential infinite, right? Because it it starts at a certain point and tends towards infinity, but there isn't already an existing kind of infinite set of days or something in heaven, in the afterlife. The problem I see is reconciling that with what you've just said, which is that God exists not kind of infinitely for an infinite amount of time, but outside of time itself. My understanding of the afterlife is somehow being with God, right? And so if the afterlife is being with God in an infinite kind of way, doesn't that mean that the afterlife is a kind of actual infinite? Or is a kind of, rather than a potential infinite?
I think what it implies, Alex, rather, is that God is in time. The view that I defend is a rather novel hybrid view, but I think it's the best view, and that is that when God creates time, he enters into time in virtue of his real causal relationship with temporal changing things, and in virtue of his knowledge of tensed facts, like what time it is now. So on the view I defend, God is timeless, sans creation, but in time, from creation going forward on into the afterlife.
Craig's idea seems to be that absent creation, God is timeless, but once the universe exists, God enters into time. This view sounds nice, but I do wonder how Craig would propose that a consciousness with free will can even make sense in a timeless setting. Timelessness would completely eliminate the possibility of any sort of causality, so I don't really think it makes sense to speak of a being existing in the absence of time.
So
that's right.
Does that mean that when we say God is timeless, as I've heard you say a number of times, we kind of mean that he was timeless, a part of him is timeless, but now is a temporal being, something like that?
Well, here it's so easy to be tricked by language.
Right.
And I think what we have to say is that God is timeless sans creation and in time subsequent to creation. And that is a non-contradictory way of stating it.
Is that non-contradictory? Because the way I'm thinking of it is God sans creation is timeless. And so God kind of exists eternally as a timeless being, but somehow at the same in the same breath exists as a temporal being as well. So is temporal and non-temporal?
There is no time. Sans creation, this is a timeless, spaceless existence, and time and space come into being at the moment of creation, which I would identify for the sake of simplicity with the Big Bang, with t equals 0, the first moment of time.
To me, this feels like another cop-out, ignoring important questions about how cause and effect would even work in the absence of time. The idea of timelessness as a mode of existence just doesn't sit right with me.
How do you get an effect with a beginning from a cause which is permanent?
Yes.
If the cause is truly sufficient for its effect, then if the cause is there permanently, the effect ought to be there permanently. How in the world do you have a permanent cause, but an effect that only begins to exist a finite time ago? And it seems to me that the best answer to that question is that the cause is a personal agent endowed with free will, because free will can initiate new effects without antecedent determining conditions. And so what I would say is that this timelessly existing free agent freely wills to create the universe, and therefore time comes into being at that moment, and this being enters into time at that moment.
Craig is a proponent of libertarian free will, and I'm surprised Alex didn't engage in some discussion about that concept. Maybe he didn't want to get too off track. Either way, I think it's really worth examining that idea, because I don't think it's a coherent one. The idea of free will is contingent on the notion of being able to do otherwise. In God, a perfect being, one would think that he would always make the perfect decision. If God will always choose the best possible course of action, then it would seem to me that he has no ability to have done otherwise. I also would wonder where Craig proposes that God's desire to create a universe comes from. It couldn't come from any outside influence, and if God is unchanging, then I don't see how any new internal motivation could emerge. To me, it would appear that the only real explanation for why God wanted to create a universe is that that desire was purely random, which also doesn't really mesh with the idea of free will.
When you say the free, it's because of the freedom of the being, and the free being hasn't made the decision. It feels like that it's begging for the word yet to be on the end of that. It hasn't made the decision yet.
I know.
But it's like we're carefully avoiding that language because of the complications of time, but it seems like the explanation that you're giving, it feels to me like naturally it invokes a sense of time. I still don't quite see how it works without time.
Well, you just have to be very careful if you're going to be philosophically precise to use tenseless verbs in your sentences and not use temporal particles like before or yet and things of that sort. And I think that we can avoid those and make coherent statements. For example, I said, sans the universe, God exists timelessly. That's a tenseless verb. Sans the universe, God does not freely choose to create the universe. So I think that these statements can be correctly made if we just watch our tenses and our adverbs.
I feel like Craig didn't adequately address the question here. Alex was asking about how this really makes sense, how it actually works without the presence of time. Craig, however, just got into the semantics of how to describe timelessness, which doesn't answer the substance of Alex's question.
I want to discuss the first premise, because a lot of the time in the literature, as far as I can see, people think that this is the kind of obvious one. It's the kind of, well, come on, of course, everything that begins to exist has a cause. Now, that's not to say there isn't argumentation behind it, but it seems like people are just far more willing to accept it as intuitively true. Have you found the
Yes.
same thing?
Well, actually, Alex, that's what I think. When I first enunciated the Kalam Cosmological Argument, to me, the first premise is a no-brainer.
Right.
I thought anybody who is intellectually honest will agree to the first premise. And so I have been amazed, frankly, at the number of non-theists who are willing to admit that the universe began to exist. I think they're impressed with the scientific evidence for the beginning of the universe, and therefore bite the bullet and say the universe came into being uncaused from nothing. And to me, that is just a compromise of one's intellectual integrity, to be honest.
I think there are very good philosophical reasons to challenge the first premise, and Craig's charge that people who accept the second premise but not the first are compromising their intellectual integrity is very dismissive outright, not even allowing for the possibility that there are reasonable arguments against the first premise. And I think it really is worth noting that there's nothing actually inconsistent about rejecting the first premise while accepting that the universe began to exist. Craig just thinks it's silly that someone would do so. I would also note that when we get into the idea that God's existence is uncaused, I don't think it's unreasonable to say that perhaps the universe's existence could have been uncaused.
On your website, Reasonable Faith, because I do my research, I found you gave 3 justifications for this first premise, reminding the listeners the first premise is everything that begins to exist has a cause. Now, the 3 justifications you give, with a bit of explanation, but just the first line is firstly that something cannot come from nothing.
The idea that something cannot come from nothing is an important concept that I would like everyone to keep in mind as we move on, because I will bring it up later.
Secondly, that if something can come from nothing, then it is inexplicable why just anything and everything doesn't come into existence from nothing or come into being from nothing.
It doesn't follow from the idea that the universe, especially in the supercondensed high-density state it would have been in prior to expansion, could come into being from nothing, that new matter within the universe ought to come into being from nothing.
And the third point is, and I quote, common experience and scientific evidence confirm the truth of premise 1.
This common experience bit is the point I think deserves the most scrutiny, and it's one that Alex is going to address as well.
There was an inconsistency that I found, which I was struggling with, or an apparent inconsistency when I was reading your points on the Kalam. And it's on this point, right? Because on the one hand, you say, if things can come into existence without a cause, then why wouldn't it be happening all the time, right? Why wouldn't a horse or an Eskimo village, as you say, just pop into existence out of nothing, right? Why don't we observe that? Now, holding that in mind, in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, you are talking about this quantum idea that quantum mechanics gives us evidence of something coming from nothing, essentially. And your response to that is to say this. You say, popularizers touting such theories as getting something from nothing, that is quantum mechanics, apparently do not understand that the vacuum is not nothing, but a sea of fluctuating energy endowed with a rich structure and subject to physical laws. Such models do not, therefore, involve a true origination ex nihilo. Okay? So help me out here. You say that quantum mechanics isn't an example of something coming from nothing because it doesn't come from nothing. But then you say, well, if something could come from nothing, why wouldn't a horse pop into being? Well, my thought is that if we did observe a horse popping into being in my living room, that similarly wouldn't be out of nothing, right? Because my living room isn't nothing.
Oh, all right. Now, here we're talking about whether there's an efficient cause for that. Remember, Aristotle distinguished between several different kinds of causes, efficient, material, formal, and so forth. And when I talk about whatever begins to exist has a cause, I'm thinking of efficient causes. There needs to be something that brings it into being. I don't think it has to have a material cause, but there does need to be at least an efficient cause that brings it into being.
I don't think that Craig really addresses Alex's concern here, which is that the physical states of affairs involved in both quantum indeterminacy and a horse popping into existence mean that neither would really be an example of something coming from nothing, or creatio ex nihilo. But I do want to address Craig bringing up the distinctions between causes, specifically the efficient and the material causes. Aristotle's definition of the efficient cause, which Craig appears to believe to be the only one necessary in the case of the universe coming into existence, is the primary source of the change or arrest. His definition of the material cause is that out of which. So the material cause for a table would be the wood that it's made of, and the efficient cause would be the carpenter fashioning the wood into the table. Again, keep this in mind for later.
But of course, the important point here for me was that the kind of beginning to exist we need to talk about in order for the Kalam to hold, in order to get our conclusion, is beginning to exist from nothing, surely. Whereas a chair doesn't begin to exist from nothing. A chair begins to exist from pre-existing material. And yes, although it makes sense to say the chair exists now and didn't exist an hour ago, what we really mean is that the material that the chair is made out of has rearranged itself, or been rearranged in such a way that we now arbitrarily give it the label of a chair, but nothing has actually begun to exist.
Oh, Alex, I think that's just well, as you say, that's included in my list of arguments so bad I couldn't.
Indeed.
Just think of your own self. You began to exist. It is absurd to think that you existed before your father's sperm and mother's egg united in conception for you to begin to exist. You didn't exist during the Jurassic period. You didn't exist during the era of galaxy formation. You began to exist about 18 years ago in this conception event. And so don't think that beginning to exist is something that is subverted by its having a material cause.
Craig's response here is infuriatingly question dodgy. What Alex is doing here is drawing a distinction between creation from nothing, creatio ex nihilo, and creation from materials, creatio ex materia. Craig's response is to seize onto some wording that isn't really the point and state the obvious, that things do, in fact, begin to exist. But Alex isn't saying that things don't start existing. He's saying that things in our experience begin existing only by virtue of the matter composing them having been arranged into a new form. Alex isn't saying that he has always existed, but that the material that makes him up has existed since at least the start of the Big Bang. Craig does get around at the end of this clip to recognizing the distinction, which is that everything that begins to exist in our experience has both an efficient cause and a material cause, but that under Craig's view, the universe has only an efficient cause and not a material cause. God did not fashion the universe out of pre-existing material. Once again, just remember that, because it'll be important.
I explicate what it means to begin to exist by saying X begins to exist at T if X exists at T, and T is the first time at which X exists.
Yeah.
And that is fulfilled for the chair and yourself and other things that begin to exist. And the point is that when we look at the things that begin to exist, we have a tremendous inductive argument that everything that begins to exist, so defined, has a cause. It's hard to think of an inductive generalization that could be more strongly supported than that.
Here's the thing, though. While Craig is right that everything we observe beginning to exist always has some efficient cause for its existence, it is also true that everything we observe beginning to exist has a material cause for its existence. So why does Craig believe it's reasonable to infer that the universe has an efficient cause, but not a material cause? If anything, the idea of an efficient cause without a material cause seems completely contradictory. How can nothing be acted upon to create something? It would be like a carpenter trying to build a chair without any materials.
What I'm being careful to say here is that everything that I'm made of existed at that time.
Yeah, right. Fair enough.
And so when we talk about beginning to exist in the sense of the common experience in order to justify premise one, we're talking about beginning to exist conceptually, beginning to exist as an arrangement, something like this, right? We're not talking about actual matter becoming instantiated or something like that.
Well, I don't think that it's necessarily just a matter of arrangement. I mean, take fundamental particles, for example, like electrons or quarks.
Mm-hmm.
They're not arrangements of anything because they are fundamental particles. You're raising an issue here as to whether or not there are composite objects, things that are arrangements of simples that are themselves not arrangements of anything. And there are certainly these sorts of fundamental particles.
That's not really what Alex is getting at. For Alex's argument, it doesn't matter whether composite objects actually exist, whatever that means. It's only important to understand that there's a difference between the things we see within the universe beginning to exist and the universe itself beginning to exist. The things that begin to exist in our experience are created from previously existing matter, while Craig proposes that the universe began to exist in a way that did not involve previously existing matter. The type of beginning to exist is fundamentally different.
I think I've hit on our disagreement then, which seems to be that you would say that we call a Homo sapien a new object that begins to exist, a new thing, because it begins to exist. Whereas I would say that conceptually it begins to exist because we've decided to call it a Homo sapiens. It's kind of the reverse, yeah. Right? I think that's the disagreement we're having.
Yeah, well, this gets into this question again that I mentioned, whether or not you think there are really composite objects or not. And however you come down on that, there are going to be certain entities that are not composite objects, like fundamental particles, like electrons and quarks and so forth. And I would say persons, like yourself. And these provide clear-cut examples of things that exist that are not just arrangements of prior matter and therefore don't have any objective reality.
Before I get into the meat of Dr. Craig's response, I have to question why he thinks persons are not composite objects. I am not a fundamental particle. I, as an entity, have practically nothing in common with quarks, for instance. Persons are made up of lots of subdivisible units. Persons have not existed since the beginning of the universe as we know it, as quarks have, but only begin existing after procreation occurs. It's really strange for Craig to equate beings that are made of lots of matter with subatomic particles. Now, I really think it's interesting that Craig keeps retreating to fundamental particles when Alex brings up the point about beginning to exist, because fundamental particles are not things that we observe beginning to exist in our everyday lives. In fact, as far as I'm aware, all matter in the universe has existed for as long as we know that the universe has. Essentially, when Craig talks about fundamental particles beginning to exist, he's talking about the universe beginning to exist. Because of that, it really feels like Craig is trying to run away from the problem.
Well, okay, so the reason why I wanted to make this argument is to try and get across the point that I feel that the only thing that, if anything, has meaningfully begun to exist, the only thing that would fulfill that criterion would be the universe itself, because everything within the universe that begins to exist in a conceptual sense only, is the argument that I was trying to make. But clearly you disagree with that.
Yes, right.
I suppose...
And I think, you're talking here about a view that is, and I hate to get technical, it's called mereological nihilism.
Yeah,
that is
yes.
to say that there are no composite objects.
Essentially, yes.
I think Alex is focusing on the wrong thing here. As I mentioned earlier, it doesn't actually matter whether you believe in the real existence of composite objects. This stuff about mereological nihilism is ultimately a distraction. Whether you think that a table can accurately be described as a real object, or whether you think the table is an illusion or an arbitrary label or whatever, it is still true that when we say that the table begins to exist, we are talking about creatio ex materia. Whereas when we talk about the universe beginning to exist, we are talking about creatio ex nihilo, which is not something that has ever been empirically observed and is a completely different phenomenon.
So I think the person who's going to take the line of mereological nihilism, well, It's worse than mereological nihilism. I mean, he has to say that there are no fundamental objects.
Well, I'm not sure that's the case. For instance, if we accept that fundamental particles exist, and what we mean by fundamental particles are simply things that can't be broken down any further. And so
Right.
what we mean when we say beginning to exist is a rearrangement of fundamental particles in such a way that it kind of that it gives rise to arbitrary labeling as a new object, right? So that's the kind of view that I would take. Not that there aren't composite things, but that everything that begins to exist is just an arrangement of composite things.
All right, that's not you mean arrangement of fundamental things?
Yes. Well, if you break it down far enough, yes.
Symbols. Right. Yes, okay, and that would be a consistent view. It's a very radical view, one that I wouldn't hold. I can't see any good reason to be a mereological nihilist.
I don't even think that the view Alex just expressed there counts as mereological nihilism. Alex specifically said he wasn't claiming that composite things don't exist, but that all composite things are arrangements of fundamental particles. And I don't see how that's even controversial. I mean, I can't think of any object that isn't made up of fundamental particles.
Okay, so perhaps I can explain why, because you say it's at least a consistent worldview. Let me try and explain why I thought this would beg the question when it came to the Kalam, was because if we accept the view that everything that begins to exist as we observe it in the world, let's say, is not actually beginning to exist in the meaningful sense, it's just a rearrangement of pre-existing matter. And ultimately, the furthest you can break it down is to fundamental particles, but those existed since the beginning of the universe, meaning that, in other words, in the meaningful sense, the only thing that began to exist was the universe, right? Now, the reason this is a problem is because to beg the question is to accept the first premise only by virtue of already having granted the conclusion. Now, if the first premise is everything that begins to exist has a cause, but the only thing that truly begins to exist in the sense we want to talk about is the universe, then the first premise just becomes the universe has a cause, which is identical to the conclusion.
Again, I think the way Alex is going about this is not the best way. The way he's talking about things beginning to exist is just inviting Craig to continue playing these language games. The actual point at hand is simply that the first premise can only reasonably be talking about Creatio ex nihilo and not Creatio ex materia, because these are two different things, and to use beginning to exist in both senses would be equivocating. So, saying everything that begins to exist has a cause in the Kalam must mean everything that is created from nothing has a cause, and since the only thing that is created from nothing is the universe itself, including the fundamental particles that Craig keeps bringing up, the first premise can be phrased as the universe has a cause.
I want your listeners to understand how radical the view is that you're expressing here. It's not just that things don't begin to exist. It's rather that these things don't exist at all. There are no such things as chairs and planets and people and skyscrapers. None of these things actually exist, and that's why they don't begin to exist. The only thing that begins to exist would be these fundamental particles. And so this is I mean, you can take that line if you want, but it's really a radical view because I know that I exist. I think Descartes is quite right about that. If there's one thing I can't doubt, it's that I exist. And I began to exist. So I think this is not, this is sort of like an academic way to try to escape the argument, but it's not a plausible solution to the person who really is looking for truth.
Dr. Craig seems really intent on putting words in Alex's mouth. Again, mereological nihilism is not actually necessary for the argument Alex is trying to make. Also, when Craig says that Alex's view requires that composite objects don't exist at all, and he counters that he knows that he himself exists, it seems to me that Craig is equivocating on the meaning of the word exist. I mean, if we want to say that no composite objects exist because things that are made of other things don't actually exist, then fine, whatever. But the consequences of that aren't that it is impossible for there to be composite objects like Dr. Craig, but rather that we have to describe Dr. Craig as a collection of particles rather than as an entity unto himself, which doesn't make him any less real. It's really less a metaphysical claim and more a weird way of labeling things, but Craig is reacting as though Alex is denying that Craig can be described as an entity, which he clearly isn't.
Important here is that you say that by denying that things begin to exist, I deny that things exist. I would rather frame it as saying something like the limits of an object, and for people who are listening, what I mean by that are the boundaries of the thing that make it that thing as opposed to something else, right? The definitional boundary that you put around that thing is not a property of the thing, but a property of us in a way, right? So it does exist conceptually. So I can make sense of saying, here is a book. But what I'm saying is that my calling this a book and my saying that this has boundaries such that this is a book and this other thing over here is not that book is a product of my mind, right? But it's like it does conceptually exist. However, the actual boundary itself is an arbitrary one.
It's a mind dependent reality. That's why I said this is a sort of anti-realism that I extremely implausible. You're saying that you construct reality by imagining these boundaries, but these are not mind-independent realities. If there were no people, there would be no books and planets and galaxies and stars.
Right, yeah, it's a strange line of thought. I would say that calling it something like anti-realism might be misleading because of the fact that I wouldn't say that nothing exists independent of the mind, right? I'm not saying that things existing or rather, existence is a product of the mind. What I'm saying is that categorizing that which exists into independent objects is a product of the mind, right?
Dr. Craig seems determined to miss the point. I don't understand why Alex is having to clarify again and again to a professional theologian what is a relatively simple and not even particularly radical view. What Alex is saying, ultimately, is that the way we box things into discrete categories is arbitrary and a product of the mind. He's not saying that things don't exist outside of the mind, and he's certainly not saying that composite objects literally aren't even actual entities. Let me put it this way. The universe is everything. That is to say, the totality of everything in existence is the definition of the universe. So when you say the universe began to exist, you are saying the totality of everything in existence began to exist. When you talk about things within the universe beginning to exist, you are describing subsets of the totality of everything in existence being modified. These are two completely separate ideas, and Craig seems to really want to avoid having to confront that fact.
Yeah, I think one thing I've learned is how radical the view is that I hold, because I think you're probably right in the implications, and I hadn't considered them to the fullest extent before, that if I'm going to say something like things only begin to exist as a rearrangement of pre-existing matter, and the beginning to exist is an arbitrary metric we put on it, that the only thing that exists definitionally as an independent object, mind independently, are fundamental particles, and everything else that exists as kind of individually discernible objects are mind dependent. Which is a really interesting radical implication of my view that I'll give some thought, and for my listeners I'll try and write an explication on that view.
If Alex has discovered that this does accurately represent his views, then that is fine, though I do feel that he's been somewhat caught by Craig's misdirections.
So if you do take that view, the sort of teleological nihilism, then you're right. We wouldn't have any inductive examples of things that begin to exist.
Right.
The first premise would still be true, that whatever begins to exist has a cause, but we wouldn't have any examples of things that begin to exist other than these fundamental particles. We still got all of those to deal with, and that's fine, but you wouldn't be able to, as you say, appeal to your common experience on this view.
Again, mereological nihilism is completely unnecessary to make the argument that creatio ex nihilo and creatio ex materia are separate concepts, and that since the first premise has to be talking about the former, we don't actually have any evidence of that in our experience.
And this is why I thought it begged the question, was because, and I guess the implications are more radical now that I think about it, but the reasoning I was thinking of was, well, if the only thing that ever really began to exist was the universe, then, as you say, that the first premise, although it doesn't become the conclusion, it means that the only thing which begins to exist is the universe. So when we say everything that begins to exist has a cause, the only example we can think of is the universe. And so by saying the first premise, you're essentially believing that because you believe the universe has a cause.
Oh, no. Now there I think that's a mistake, Alex.
Okay.
I have actually reformulated the Kalam cosmological argument to make it more modest by rephrasing the first premise in the following way. If the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause. Second premise, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. So that statement of the argument would be fully in line with mereological nihilism. If the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause.
Craig's reformulated argument is quite interesting because it's much more to the point and doesn't rely on the equivocation of two different meanings of beginning to exist to be effective in people's minds. That said, I do feel that it becomes easier to reject as well. Our understanding of causality as humans comes from both our evolutionarily imposed innate sense of causality and from our experience with it in real life. Because of that, I don't think we can trust our intuitions with regards to something like this on the scale of the universe. I would ultimately question this premise as well.
I would agree with you that if you reformulate the Kalam, or even if you keep it in the original form but use a different justification, you're not begging the question. My essay was just trying to make the point that if you justify it in that inductive manner, it seems to me that you're begging the question.
Well, I'll agree with you that the inductive argument wouldn't work if you have this kind of mereological nihilism. And then I would fall back on the two metaphysical arguments, which for me are the most important, as opposed to the inductive argument.
So let's go over those two metaphysical arguments again. The first is that something cannot come from nothing. While this seems obvious, I do wonder whether we can really know this. After all, I've never encountered any nothing, and it seems to me that nobody else has either. So why is this asserted so confidently? Just because something seems obvious doesn't make it true, especially when we're dealing with subjects that are so far removed from our common experience. When we're talking about nothing, and I mean nothing in the most strict, absolutely nothing sense of the word, we just don't have access to nothing. We live in a world of somethings. We are something, or part of something, or made up of something, take your pick, and by virtue of that somethingness, we can never experience nothing. Because of that, I'm hesitant to accept any hard statements about the relationship between nothing and something. Plus, it's worth noting, Craig's proposal about the universe's existence, that God is its efficient cause and it has no material cause, actually requires the creation of something from nothing. The second metaphysical argument, though really it's more just a defense of the first, is that if something can come into being from nothing, then it becomes inexplicable why just anything or everything doesn't come into being from nothing. Alex earlier brought up an objection to this, being that if a horse materialized in his living room, that would not in fact be an example of something coming from absolutely nothing. However, even if we take this to mean new matter appearing completely randomly, then I also have a few things to say about that. First, as I said before, it just doesn't follow from the idea that the universe itself came from nothing that new matter ought to appear within the universe. Following along those lines, if matter were to come into being from nothing, it doesn't seem unreasonable that some of that matter could form closed systems like a universe, and no more matter would appear in a universe after it's already come into being. So universes could in fact be coming into being all the time, and new matter is simply not appearing within them. Finally, maybe new matter actually is popping into existence within the universe all the time. The universe is really big, man. We live on one rock. But anyway, if some or all of that sounds implausible, that's entirely fair. I'm not trying to offer any of those things as definitive answers. I'm just trying to demonstrate that there are in fact potential explanations for why, if something can come into being from nothing, new matter isn't constantly popping into existence within the universe. I'd be happy to hear other ideas. Basically, I think Craig's metaphysical justifications for the first premise are, much like the inductive justification, quite flawed. So again, while the first premise sounds obvious, no matter which formulation you're using, I think that there are good reasons to doubt its truth.
Yeah, now the argument that I didn't want to put it in your mouth was one that I've heard elsewhere of people would say the argument that the reason you can't say that only universes can come into being out of nothing is because nothing doesn't have any properties, and so therefore can't have a kind of preference for universes over other things.
Yeah.
My response to that was to say, what if the necessity of it being a universe is not a property of the nothing, but a property of the thing? And let me explain myself. For example, if we human beings create a circle, it has to be round, right? We can't create a square circle.
Right.
But that's not due to a property of us. That's due to a property of the circle, right?
Yeah.
So in the same way, although nothing has no properties and so can't prefer universes, what if it can only... What if only universes can come from nothing because of a property of the universe, not because of a property of nothing?
I'm not totally sure about this argument, but I want to explore it. When we talk about the universe, as I said before, we're talking about the totality of everything that exists. The universe is everything. That being the case, I would say that anything that just came into being from absolute nothingness might inherently be a universe in its own bubble of reality. I don't know if that really makes sense or not, but I just wanted to put it out there. Okay, well, that's all the commentary I have on this conversation for now. Thanks for sticking around. After all that heavy philosophical talk and semantics and whatnot, I'd like to share a little meme created by Hazmat Guy on Twitter. It's not relevant or anything, but I wanted to put it in a video.
If I asked you how you know that the Earth is round, you would show me photographs from outer space or offer me measurable data. But what photographs could you show? What measurements could you provide that prove that there is a God? The fact is, you can't.
And that's everything. Before I go, I just wanted to direct everyone to Theoretical Bullshit's videos on the Kalam argument again, and to his channel in general. I mean, it's pretty dead, but you don't seem to have an issue with watching videos from dead channels. So, yeah, like, comment, subscribe, follow me on Twitter, and see you next time. Stay safe out there.